the magician's lover was mysteriously murdered. To solve the case and find the killer of his beloved, he summoned her spirit to uncover the murderer. Edward was an outstanding magician with incredibly unique and impressive magic performances. In one of his remarkable acts, he cut open an orange, took its seeds, and placed them in a plant pot. Placing his hand on the pot, the orange seeds suddenly sprouted, grew into a plant, bloomed with flowers, and bore fruit rapidly, creating a unique and captivating scene that left a strong impression on the audience. Since childhood, he was drawn to a street magician's performance. From then on, he worked hard to become a skilled magician. His magic tricks caught the attention of a girl named Sophia. The seed of love began to sprout. However, she belonged to the royal family, and interacting with commoners was not allowed for her. The two could only secretly meet in the woods to enjoy brief moments of happiness. One evening, when they planned to escape together, they were unfortunately discovered by Sophia's family. Sophia was forcibly taken away, and Edward was warned that if such an incident occurred again, his entire family would be killed. Fearing for the safety of his family, Edward realized that the only way to end this relationship was to leave that place. 15 years later, Edward became a famous magician. His performances were so enchanting that even the prince came to watch. Before the show began, Edward invited a guest onto the stage. The prince wanted his fiancée Sophia to participate in the performance. As Edward looked at her, he recognized Sophia, but she did not recognize him. Undeterred, Edward continued the performance. Sophia was dressed in a red cape and led to a mirror. Edward instructed her to follow his commands. First, she greeted, then spun around, all seemingly normal. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror ceased to move like her. Another person appeared behind her reflection, wielding a sword. Sophia quickly turned to look, but there was no one there. The person in the mirror raised the sword, killing her reflection. The audience below screamed in fear. Edward raised his hand, and a puff of smoke emerged from the mirror. Impressed by the performance, the prince personally approached Edward and invited him to perform at the royal palace. Edward graciously agreed, and before leaving, he uttered a sentence that made Sophia recognize him. The next day, she secretly climbed onto Edward's wagon, and the two still shared a deep love. But now, when facing each other, they both acted reserved. This encounter reached the hands of Inspector Ool, who was in the service of the prince. He immediately sought out Edward to warn him not to approach Sophia again. The performance day at the palace quickly arrived. The prince stepped onto the stage and introduced the famous magician he had invited. Edward stood before a blank sheet of paper and began to draw without using a brush. Slowly, a painting appeared on the white sheet, depicting the king's portrait. The audience below immediately cheered and congratulated, but the prince remained suspicious. He immediately went on stage, requesting a full-body search of Edward. Seeing this, the audience said that he should not cause any trouble and let Edward continue the performance. This made the prince somewhat hesitant. To save face, he told Edward to perform magic without any props. Edward agreed with no signs of concern. He then borrowed the prince's precious sword, stood it upright on the floor, and released his grip. The sword remained still. He began to narrate the story of the Excalibur sword, emphasizing that only the true king could draw it. Edward invited a general to try to pull the sword, but it seemed firmly stuck to the ground, impossible to pull. Frustrated, the general had to step back. Edward then invited another person, a strong young man, who exerted all his strength but couldn't budge it either. It was then the prince's turn, but unexpectedly, he couldn't pull it out. Below the stands, people started murmuring that he might not be the true king. The prince glanced at Edward, who finally opened the mechanism to allow the prince to draw the sword. Feeling humiliated, the prince immediately declared the end of the performance and ordered Ool to kill Edward. That evening, Sophia sought out Edward. Both of them couldn't control themselves and made love. Afterward, Sophia revealed a significant secret about the prince. He was planning to overthrow the king, and she was also part of his plan. She disclosed that the prince had ordered Ool to eliminate Edward, so they decided to escape together the next night. The following day, Edward withdrew all the money from the bank, packed it in luggage, and handed it to Sophia. He also arranged for his assistant to pick up Sophia, but unfortunately, Ool witnessed everything. He immediately went to inform the prince that the two of them intended to escape. That night, the prince, furious, slapped Sophia in anger for betraying him, but she just turned around and walked away. This further angered the prince, prompting him to chase her into the stable. A scream from Sophia echoed, and then she rode away on a horse. The guards were astonished by the sight. At this point, Edward waited at the rendezvous point but didn't see Sophia arriving, sensing that something was wrong. The next day, Sophia's horse returned home with a large bloodstain on its back. Everyone began searching, and eventually, they found Sophia's body by a small canal. Edward immediately jumped into the water beside Sophia, crying out in grief. Inspector Uhl arrived at the scene to investigate. The doctor announced that the victim had died from blood loss, and he also handed Uhl a red gemstone that he had discovered on Sophia's body. Edward directly accused the prince of her murder, but despite the inspector knowing the truth, he dared not apprehend the prince, and the case remained unsolved. Not long after, they captured a murderer, but it didn't satisfy Edward because he knew the true murderer was none other than the prince. Shortly afterward, Edward bought an old theater and began performing magic. During one show, as he raised his hand, a figure appeared on the table. The audience was curious and asked the spirit a lot of questions, but before the spirit could answer those questions, Edward quickly pulled it back. Everyone felt puzzled. They no longer believed it was just a magic trick, but that he truly had the ability to summon spirits. In this manner, Edward quickly regained his fame. The news reached the prince, who immediately ordered Uhl to arrest Edward on charges of fraud. However, this proved impossible as there was no evidence. That evening, Uhl sent a police officer to sneak into the theater for investigation, but he was quickly busted. Edward's performance continued, and someone in the audience claimed to have seen a ghostly child wandering around. Initially skeptical, the police chief was startled when the child passed through the arms of an audience member and stood in front of him. At that moment, the police arrested Edward, leaving the crowd extremely dissatisfied. They directly surrounded the police. Uhl warned that if they attacked the police station, the charges against Edward would be even more severe. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Edward stepped onto the balcony and explained that his performances were all illusions and entertainment, devoid of any real supernatural elements. People dispersed after hearing this. Later, Edward requested Uhl to release him, asserting that he had only declared his acts as magic tricks, not fraud. Reluctantly, the police chief agreed to let him go. This failure enraged the prince once again, and he berated Uhl as a useless person incapable of accomplishing anything. He then disguised himself as a commoner to attend Edward's performance. In the performance, Edward raised his hand. Deceased soul was summoned, none other than Sophia. Everyone asked her who had killed her, wondering if it was the prince. Sophia revealed that the murderer was right here, coincidentally pointing to the prince who was present. This performance immediately stirred anger among the people below the stage. Some rushed to find Uhl, urging him to arrest the prince for punishment. The prince, naturally furious, wanted Uhl to arrest Edward once again. However, Uhl admired Edward's talent, so he advised him not to perform this trick again. If he had to, they would have to imprison him. Edward, of course, refused. The performance began again, with Uhl led a large number of officers to watch. Edward continued as usual, summoning the spirit of Sophia, causing a stir among the audience. Right at this time, Uhl stepped onto the stage and declared the arrest of Edward, despite objections from the people below the stage. However, the moment he touched Edward, his hand passed through, leaving everyone astonished. Edward slowly rose, passed through the sword, and then vanished directly. It was evident that he was also a spirit. Inspector Uhl then questioned all the staff, searching every nook and cranny, but found no trace of Edward. They could only go to Edward's house for a search, but even there, they found nothing. Suddenly, a book caught the attention of the inspector. Upon opening it, he discovered a sketch of a necklace, seemingly of no significance. However, he realized something. He immediately ran to the stable of the prince to investigate. Indeed, he found a necklace identical to the one in the drawing. After opening it, he discovered a photo of a young Edward. This was clearly Sophia's necklace. Additionally, he found a green gemstone that seemed very familiar. The inspector went to inspect the prince's sword and noticed that it was missing 2 gemstones, the same one found on Sophia's body and the one discovered in the stable. This proved that the prince had killed Sophia. Ul came to arrest the prince. He adamantly claimed innocence, stating that he hadn't committed murder and no one had the authority to arrest him. However, the inspector escalated the case to the king, including the prince's intention to overthrow the throne. The king himself would come to apprehend the prince at any time. Infuriated, the prince took out his gun and demanded the inspector to hand over his sword. At that moment, the king's army arrived. Fearing for his life, the prince shot himself. When the soldiers broke in, the inspector had no choice but to surrender and explain the situation. Fortunately, he was not implicated and was released. As he was leaving, a young boy called him and handed him a package. Inside was a book illustrating the secrets of orange tree performance. Now awake, he reached into his pocket and discovered that the necklace was missing. He realized that someone ahead looked very much like Edward and immediately chased him. Edward hurried to the train station and boarded the train. Ul arrived too late and couldn't catch up. Suddenly, the inspector remembered something. Edward had previously arranged for an assistant here. The assistant was the doctor who declared Sophia's death, so Sophia might have faked her death. Back on the night of the murder, Sophia had gone to the prince's room first, drugged his drink, and intentionally provoked him to lead him to the stable. She waited until he was unconscious and created a staged scene to make it look like she was killed. Then, pretending to be injured, she left on horseback. The next day, Edward was the first to reach her, undoubtedly having given her a temporary breath-suppressing drug. They then conspired with a cooperative medical practitioner to deceive Inspector Ul. They gave Sophia an antidote, and together they staged a spirit-summoned act. It turned out that Edward had urged Sophia to escape, but she insisted that fleeing would only provoke the prince to hunt them down. Therefore, he devised this plan to deceive the prince, not expecting the prince to be both cruel and vulnerable, ultimately succumbing to the inspector's words and committing suicide. This is the end of the movie. If you enjoy it, please like and subscribe to support my channel. Thanks for watching.